Hi. I'll go ahead and start. Can you all hear me fine? Awesome. So I'm going to talk about slightly different thing, not programming exactly. It's more about documentation, and this talk is kind of based on a project that I worked on, a documentation project with Perl in the latter half of the last year, and that was kind of a part of the Google season of docs. So for those of you who do not know about Google season of docs, I'll just give you a little bit of context about that. It kind of works in a way that it's an initiative started by Google back in the year 2017, and the idea was to bring open source organizations and freelance technical writers closer to each other, so that the organizations who kind of need their documentation to be improved, and then there are freelance technical writers who need some work, so they can kind of come together, improve the documentation, and make these open source organizations better. So it works kind of in a way that on the one hand we have open source organizations, and there are things happening every single day. The tools are developing, the technology is advancing and all, and the documentation in most cases does not keep pace with the advancements of the tool itself. And then there are freelance technical writers, people like me, who need work, who need some experience, who kind of want to work with these organizations, but there is this gap which Google fills with Google season of docs. And last year was the third season of this initiative, and that is where I got to work with Perl on this 6 month long project. We started working somewhere in May and ended in the mid of November. And the idea was to come up with a plan with which we can improve the documentation of Perl. So a little bit about the documentation of Perl itself. And this is coming from the experience I had when I first interacted with Perl's documentation. So before 15th May, or I'd say 15th April last year, I had never interacted with Perl's documentation. So when I first looked at it and I came across these documents, so there were more than 100 documents on a single web page of all sorts of things having in there, tutorials and reference articles, FAQs, and other related documents. And this is what I looked at the first time. So this GIF is kind of about my experience when I first looked at the documentation. I kept on scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. The page never ended. And by the time I reached the end, I had no idea what I'd read at the top. So navigation was a big problem. And this is something which I kind of wanted to improve in this project. One of the major things which we came across at different stages of the project, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. And navigation was an important concern. So the documentation of Perl, it has a lot of useful information, a lot of things that users can benefit from, but it needs a bit of organization so that what they're looking for, they can find it easily and improve their user experience as well. So the project was basically divided into 4 stages. And the first one was content audit, which was nothing but an evaluation of all the existing documentation that Perl has online. And then we went ahead and conducted a gap analysis, where we talked to users who had different levels of expertise with Perl and gathered their feedback, what they think about documentation, what are the things that they struggle with, and where do we want documentation to be in the next few years, say. And then we talked about the organization or the information architecture on the website itself. How is the documentation organized and presented, and what are the gaps that need to be filled out over there? And the last thing was to come up with a roadmap for the future, to kind of list down the projects and tasks which can be carried out in the future so the documentation can actually be improved. And this is a timeline of the project itself. As you can see, we kind of started on 15th May, and I spent the first couple of weeks in understanding the documentation itself, understanding Perl and how things were working there. And then I started off with all the phases. And by the mid of November, we had a final report of the project, which I'll share at the end. You can look through it, look at all the things that we did during the project. So we talk about the first phase, which was the content audit. As I mentioned, that it was nothing but an evaluation of the existing content. So what we did was that I went through all the existing documents, all the individual documents present on the web page itself, and I created this pretty long, overwhelming kind of content audit spreadsheet, I'd say. It was based on the principles of content strategy toolkit, which Megan Casey discusses in her book. And it's actually a very interesting practice which you can apply to pretty much all the documentation, whether online or offline, to understand what is the major structure being followed there. Are there any missing pieces of information? When was it last updated? And this is something that we created. We've included the types of documents, and whether it is this one particular document is designed for new audience or whether it is for expert developers. And this is where we kind of evaluated all the existing documentation. Some of the major things that we identified were that navigation was a big issue. As I mentioned previously as well, it was not easy to navigate through all the documents, whether you're looking at an individual document and you're scrolling through it. Sometimes documents are pretty long. You reach the bottom, there is no way to jump onto any other heading right from there. You have to scroll all the way up. And then types of documents and the way they were organized, that was a little confusing for new users. And the audience groups, there was no specific distinction in the documentation itself, whether a certain type of document is for the new audience or whether it is for the expert developers who know Perl well and have been working with it for, say, years. After we kind of finished this content audit and had an idea what we have in our hands on the online documentation itself, the next step was to conduct the gap analysis. And we did it in two phases. In the first one, I talked to the people who are working on Perl, the people in the Perl community and team itself, and gathered their feedback to understand where they want the documentation to be and what are the things that need to be improved. The second one, which took more time and was a little more important, was to gather the feedback of users. So we didn't have a lot of time to reach out to a lot of users, but what we did was that we used the Write to Docs Slack community and gathered help from some of the volunteers. 4 people volunteered for it. They had different levels of expertise, different knowledge about Perl, and they gave their feedback about their experiences when they interacted with the documentation itself. 3 major things were highlighted in that phase. One, that navigation, again, was a problem for the users. And they mentioned that the organization of documentation into sections and subsections was not super clear as well. One of the volunteers said that, I feel like seeking information is finding a needle in a haystack. So the information is right there. They were able to find all they were looking for, but after spending a lot of time, and it was not easy for them to kind of navigate through all the documentation. The other important part was the presentation or the design of the web page and the documentation. That is something that we didn't get a chance to address in the project itself, but it is something that can be worked on in the future. And at the end of this phase, we created this detailed spreadsheet where I organized all of the issues and all of the gaps that we had based on these categories that I've just mentioned: navigation, organization, and presentation. And then we moved on to the information architecture, in simple words, the organization of the documentation itself on the website. This also was conducted in 2 parts. In the first one, we evaluated the existing information architecture and highlighted where the gaps are, what are the gaps that need to be filled out. And then we created this new, pretty extensive sort of information architecture. You can see here some of the things that we focused on were that we divided the information into sections and subsections, which are pretty clearly identified here. And then another important part was to enter this section along with all of those, the related sections, where we focused on creating cross-links between the documents and also adding some of the external links so that if users are looking for some external information, they can also get that. This also reflected on the needs which they kind of identified in their feedback in the second phase, that needs of the audience when they are looking at certain piece of documentation and they want to get some related documents to it, but they weren't getting it from the documents itself. So kind of adding those related sections with all of these. And the last one was, the idea here was to create a roadmap for the future, not to just leave the things as some of the issues that we've identified, but also kind of create a plan for the future. And this is where we divided tasks into different projects and tasks themselves and identified some of the limitations that were there. Talking to the Perl community was super helpful there. And we also brought in the feedback from the users here. And you can see here this sheet that I've created. I left the commitment section here blank because I think I am not in a state to kind of assign resources to specific tasks themselves. This is a task that I left for the Perl community itself. To summarize some of the major takeaways, the solutions that we recommended at the end of the project were to use the proposed information architecture, which is something that's not set in stone. Of course, it's going to change as new documents develop and all. So use that as an inspiration and then create a better information architecture. Reorganize the documents in a way so that the users can easily interact with it, can navigate with ease. And then the last and almost a very important part was to focus on the style guide. So it was interesting to see that Perl had a style guide, but most of the documents were not following that style guide. And also the style guide itself needed to be a little more elaborate and comprehensive. So using that as a starting point and then making that style guide more comprehensive and making sure that all the documents are fitting the style guide themselves. Some of the challenges or limitations, we didn't get time to conduct a formal user research. We only got feedback from 4 users, which is not a big number. And also we weren't able to get a big diversity in the people who had different experiences with Perl. So this is something where time was a big factor. We couldn't invest a lot of time in that. And then also we couldn't go ahead and edit all the individual documents because there were already a lot of existing documents and took a lot of time to conduct the audit and create this roadmap itself. And the design aspect or the presentation of documentation also did not get much attention in the project itself, because that is something that can be worked on later once we have a proper style guide and all the documents kind of fit those standards, then we can move on to the presentation of it. Some of the people who were really important in the entire project phase and helped me a lot in working through it, so it's definitely important to mention them. And you can scan this QR code to look at the report that we had at the end. Also, you can use the URL if you want. And that's all I had. Thank you so much.